Erin, let's talk a bit more about nurses in particular. Prior to the pandemic, you estimated that North Carolina was facing a probable shortage of about 12,500 nurses. But with the pandemic stretching many nurses to their limit, what do you believe that estimated shortage looks like today?
Yes, thank you for the question. It's really important. As we just heard, even before the pandemic, we were looking at shortages. And with burnout and with nurses exiting the workforce to become travelers, we actually projected that shortage increases to 21,000 nurses. And then if we add on the fact that we're going to be competing with other states for nurses, that exacerbates the shortage. So one of the things we discovered in our modeling efforts was more than half of our new nurses every year who come into the state are from out of state. And so if we're in competition, it's going to exacerbate and make those shortages even worse.
So let me stick with you for a moment. What kind of impact would a shortage like what you have described have on our healthcare system overall?
Tremendous, tremendous impacts. I mean, if you remember early in the pandemic, we were talking about ventilators and we were talking about ICU beds, and we all kept saying, but what about the staff that are needed to be with those beds and be with those patients? And so in a critical nursing shortage, you look at beds that can't be staffed, patients, as we just heard, that can't be seen. We have longer wait times for care, and those patients who need care immediately we'll have higher mortality rates. And so we also, that's on the patient side, the risk of dying is higher, the risk of becoming sicker is greater. But for the nurses themselves, there's also huge impacts, as we just heard. I mean, what about the moral distress of not being able to care for patients the way you want to be able to care for patients? Huge issue. But I love the story about resilience. It's there. So we're also seeing that as well.
Thank you so much, Erin. Gerald, let me turn to you. Outside of healthcare, what are some other industries that are facing big challenges with worker shortages?
Thank you, Anita. It's great to be here. I think one of the biggest, and the recent job openings and labor turnover survey illustrated this, is in the entertainment and hospitality industry, leisure and hospitality, so think restaurants and hotels. They face one of the largest shortages in terms of companies that are looking to hire, and they also indicate about roughly 10% of jobs that are out there or they're 10% are job openings, which is up from less than 5% before the pandemic. So there's a huge need in that industry. It also happens to be that that's the industry where in our labor shortage, and that there were also 1.4 million jobs short relative to where we were prior to the pandemic. So companies are out there looking, and they're not able to find the labor. And so there are still places where restaurants and hotels are closed or working on smaller staffs, but they can't find those workers. That's what that latest data suggests. So 10% job openings rate in that industry.
Wow. Well, of course, meeting the demand for labor requires us to talk a little bit about education. And I want to turn now to Machelle to talk about education. So both of your parents were public school teachers, and I know this issue is very close to your heart. A November 2021 survey showed that nearly half of all teachers were considering switching jobs. What are your thoughts as to what's causing this finding?
Yes, thank you, Anita, for that question. It is near and dear to my heart. My parents were public educators for 34 years. And they loved it. And actually, my mom still spells around us. She was a second grade teacher, and I remind everybody here can spell, Mom. But, it saddens me today as I look at the profession of teaching for a number of reasons. One, because we are seeing teachers leave. Secondly, frankly, I think that the respect and the understanding of the impact that teachers have on our lives at times is often forgotten. We have talked a lot about investing in our teachers, in their salaries, in their classrooms. And today, in North Carolina, teachers spend about $500 of their own money, for example, for school supplies. So the resources are needed for our teachers. We are also should pay attention to the diversity that's needed in our teaching profession. So I believe that they are leaving because of burnout. They are leaving because many in that profession are working 3 jobs to make ends meet because of the lower paying salary and the resources that are required that they sometimes take out of their pockets. And I think that, if we all think back as to who really impacted us or kind of pushed us in a certain direction to where we are today, who was it that believed in us when others didn't? It was a teacher. And so because of the impact, because how they touched so many lives and everyone's lives, I believe we need to invest more in our teachers, whether that's salaries, whether that's resources for the classroom, or whether that is, showing the appreciation, which this is Teacher Appreciation Week or month, I believe, showing that appreciation for how they actually prepare our youth for the future, prepare them for the jobs and the workforce that we're talking about here today.
So let me stick with you for a moment and talk about impact. North Carolina has been ranked one of the best states to do business, and we continue to add more and more jobs thanks to you and your department and your partners. How do we ensure then that we have the talent pool necessary to keep up with this growth?
Yeah, that is a priority for the state and definitely needs to be. The way that we're going to do this is to work together, number one, around a common mission and focus of ensuring that we have the talent for the jobs today and tomorrow, that we're able to meet the business needs. Because as you know, it does us no good, as we just heard about the entertainment industry and restaurants, if we have people who are skilled, but they're not skilled to meet those needs and demands of what the economy and businesses are telling us today, we still have a gap. As Commerce has a First in Talent plan that we launched, and that First in Talent plan is focused solely on our top asset, which is our people. I have not met with one company that does not ask about talent, the workforce. Are we going to be able to hire in North Carolina? Do we have the diverse, skilled talent? Fortunately, we have a university and community college system that we continue to need to invest more in to produce the talent. We also have organizations across the state, Anita, that are focused on helping us with this challenge that we have and frankly, problem that we have before, such as My Future NC, where the mission is to have 2 million, I believe it is, post-secondary and highly qualified credentials by 2030. The Chamber is working with companies to ensure that we are focused on the needs of industry. There are organizations and entities across the state, and I'm really pleased to see that we are coming together around this common need and coming up with different ideas. So we're going to have to invest in our community with those entrepreneurs and small businesses out there, building more talent through those pipelines, invest in our education system, invest and put forward strong advocacy for policies that make our economy thrive and for ones that are going to attract and build a talent pool here in the state. And most importantly, to meet the needs today and the future, it is very competitive. So I believe that we're going to have to be more creative and innovative about how we develop that talent and what we're focusing on.
So Gerald, Machelle has talked about the state really coming together and focusing on talent development, both for today's needs and tomorrow. Some people might be surprised that the data indicate that urban areas such as the Triangle and Charlotte are facing more acute worker shortages, given how many people are moving to this area. That may be the cause for surprise. Help us think through how this issue of talent development, of workforce availability varies for different parts of the state.
So I think you've highlighted this issue about kind of the urban-rural divide. And that's effectively what's happened is North Carolina has had huge growth, and it's that we are creating more jobs than the number of people that are coming to the state. So we're in this fortunate position that the state is creating a lot of jobs, and in particular they're occurring though in in regions such as the Triangle and the Triad and Charlotte and you're just not getting enough people that are moving into the state to meet all those job needs. And so, we've been fortunate that we've had people moving from out of state, and we have a good growth in immigrant population. Students come and then they, from abroad, then they stay. But all of those numbers are slowing. As we know, immigration has slowed substantially. It's been slowing substantially and slowed substantially post-COVID. And so we're just not getting enough people into the state to meet those job needs. In terms of the urban-rural divide, what's happening is you're just seeing, and this is a nationwide issue, an increased concentration in jobs located in urban areas, and that's a combination. In our kind of more technology-based economy and information-based economy, you have these network effects where people want to work where other people are. COVID, and we're still sorting this out, is throwing a wrench into that. But generally, you find that people benefit from being near other people. So if you're in a center where there are multiple university hospitals, as we are in the Triangle, you have startups that will come and want to take advantage of that. And so all of those things work together where you have a situation where these agglomerations of people want to be together and want to be close. And also, if you're trying to attract talent, that talent wants to be somewhere where they're the culture, the arts. So restaurants, and so all of that means that until very recently, you've seen just an increased growth occurring in the cities and less demand in more rural areas. Now, COVID, we're still sorting out if this is, and this has been a trend for 100 years. We're still sorting out whether that's going to be the case post-COVID, as people have been able to do more telecommuting. But I think that generally the corporations and the centers will remain in the major hubs. And the question is, will the workforce and pull demand outside of those hubs? And so that's an open question. And that's for people specifically who can work outside, at home, as opposed to nursing, which you can't have that happen. So it's very specific on what your industry is and what your skill level is, and whether you can telecommute or not.
I've got some questions about solutions and diagnostics, but before I get to those, I wanted to see whether Erin or Machelle wanted to weigh in on the differences in the labor market in urban and rural areas.
Yes, I'd really.
I wanted.
Both. I love it. Yes.
So I wanted to mention, I had a meeting just earlier this week. My days are mixing up. I think it was ended last week with the company Emphasis. Emphasis is an IT organization based here. And that meeting was solely focused on how we engage the rural communities and residents in rural communities in their workforce. We have a follow-up meeting. They're a company that has focused in on our rural residents. And as you mentioned in the last statement about being able to kind of work from everywhere, and we've had that case study proven during the pandemic, That's exactly what they're doing. And so I believe that it is imperative for companies to, where they can, reach out for those rural residents and find ways to engage them and hire them, because they are surely, you don't have to live in these hub centers, as we mentioned, and rural North Carolina has the talent and hopefully can participate and engage. The other thing that I wanted to mention, Anita, that I failed to mention earlier, that we have to cast a much broader net, and for many, a new net, in our recruiting of talent to address this labor supply shortage. So those untapped and underserved populations, we're going to have to be more intentional about recruiting and hiring those. North Carolina has the largest veteran population here. We have those residents who can fill jobs. Our neurodiverse population, those on the autistic spectrum. We have an internship program in North Carolina that is targeted at those individuals and in bringing them into the workforce, hiring them. Commerce has participated in that internship. Workers who have different abilities, or those who are able differently, those who have previously involved justice records, or youth and senior workers. We have to be intentional, and we have to make sure that we are targeting underserved, underrepresented, and untapped populations. Talent comes in all forms, shapes, and sizes, and from all different locations. And not only does that help us solve the problem, it also helps us underscore and be models for diversity, equity, and inclusion as we go about this challenge.
Excellent. Erin, you had a response also.
Yes.
Weigh in.
This is so exciting, this conversation. So the rural-urban divide is one that we look at in our research. And when we talk about a nursing shortage, our research shows that the greatest shortages will be, as Gerald was saying, in urban areas, because that's where the largest health systems are. So 10,000 of that shortage will be, of the 12,000, will be for registered nurses in our urban communities. But when you look at the licensed practical nurse, those are nurses who are educated for about 18 months in the community college system, who tend to work in assisted living and long-term care. That shortage is in rural communities. And we've seen a lot of really important press around this. When you can't staff nursing homes, when you can't staff long-term care, and being driven by an aging population, that's of huge concern. But there's some really bright spots out there. And one of the things that our research did was to look at community colleges and four-year universities. Where were their grads going 2 years after they finished? And so we saw this incredible pattern out in the southeast region of North Carolina. Tends to be rural. I don't know if you know, Moore County is the lowest ranked in health outcomes. But UNC Pembroke, for example, was putting 50% of its grads in the rural community, in the local area. And those community colleges were really contributing to the local market. And so we have these shortages, and I'm probably segueing, Anita, into your next conversation, but we have levers to solve them. And we can look at the data and figure out where are the shortages, where are the universities and community colleges that are contributing to those. I also want to pick up on this concept of the career laddering. So we have people, one of the beauties of nursing is the cooperation between our community college system and our four-year universities, enabling licensed practical nurses to become registered nurses, for registered nurses who have an associate degree with the community college to go on to become registered nurses with a baccalaureate degree, or even go beyond to become advanced practice nurses. And I think as we're looking at a nurse shortage and we're doing the skill development that the Secretary is talking about, those models are out there and they will increase retention. They will increase the recruitment into the nursing profession. So these are some of the themes that we saw in our research that I think are very important to look at across. It's not one shortage across North Carolina. It depends on where you are in North Carolina and where the setting is, a hospital setting versus a long-term care setting. So
I love the thoughtfulness and energy and optimism that all of you bring to this. Let's take some more questions from our audience on Facebook Live. Virginia from Raleigh asks, the critical shortage of direct support staff for people with disabilities causes serious hardship. What strategies can make these jobs attractive to bridge the divide between people who need assistance and people who need jobs? And Erin, I think you started to answer this question, but I'll pitch it to you for anything else you might say.
Yes, no, this is exactly the kind of career laddering that we're talking about. So these are jobs that, are critical to caring for people and need to be supported and need to be recognized. But let's also talk about valuing them. We have to value the workers and what they're doing wherever they're working. And specifically with that population, I think it's critical.
Thank you. Next question. This comes from Eric. How much is the level of wages being offered contributing to the labor shortages? Gerald, I think as chief economist, we ought to give this one to you.
So that's a good question. I think what you're seeing is people are saying to themselves, well, if I'm going to work, I want to be compensated. And you've had this, and again, it very much depends on your skill ladder. So you've had people who have lower skills their wages have not kept up with inflation for 40, almost 40 years. And so because of the strong demand right now, you are seeing large wage increases. Unfortunately, right now, as we speak, that those are being eaten up by inflation. But I think in a market where there's just very limited supply and increased demand, you're likely, this is a good time to be negotiating and with companies, and so I think that's a point where you think that we're at a period where wages are likely to rise. And I think at points rise more than inflation. So that's something that has definitely been keeping people out of the labor force, and you're starting to see people re-enter the labor force. I think because of that, because they're seeing decent wage gains. And I think to previous points about skills, I think one of the things that you can do is increase training and look for training in areas where there is growth in demand in healthcare professions, where you have the ability to train up and get those skills and then move it, and then you get compensated for that. So I think that's somewhere, and at the Keenan Institute we're actually developing some indicators that are going to look at where skills gaps exist, where there's strong demand for certain skills and weak supply for them. And on the other hand, work with companies and work with the government to say, here are places where if you developed those skills, you could really get some substantial growth. And so by kind of doing economic development. So I think all of those things will combine to create potentially significant wage gains if you can move into those areas where there's strong demand.
So I really want to ask you, are wage increases causing inflation or the consequence of inflation? But I'm going to not ask you that question so that we can get a couple more Facebook Live questions. I'm taking you to lunch to ask you that question. Right. David from Durham asks, with the workforce changing, what are companies doing to meet the demands of workers? We're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next segment, because I do think workers have different expectations. But do any of you want to take a stab at this?
I would like to jump in here. So I think this is a really important question, David, and it's one we think about. So at the risk of Gerald, I like the economic argument. I think compensation and benefits do matter, particularly for nurses. One of the things that really matters for nurses is how work is organized. And the actual creating an organizational environment and an organizational culture where nurses feel valued, where they're not rushed off their feet, where they're able to work part-time. A lot of nursing shifts are, long shifts, but giving them flexibility to work part-time, taking away the huge documentation that they have to do to get paid. So there's all these things I think really important around compensation and benefits, and I don't want to dismiss that, but I do want to emphasize that companies do play a role in retention and designing jobs that people want to have. I think is incredibly important conversation to be having right now.
Erin, thank you for that reminder, because it's exactly the case. I mean, we're seeing that in the data where people are looking well beyond just their compensation.
Yeah.
It's, does the company value me? Does the company give me the flexibility?
Exactly.
And we're actually doing some research on this in terms of women choosing to work for companies because they're getting women-specific health benefits. And so that's something that in this labor shortage, again, I think you point out it's a very important point that you go where your workers are looking for, and that might not just be compensation. In many cases, it's the flexibility, it's certain types of benefits.
And Anita,
So I need to wrap, but I'm gonna let Madam Secretary have the last word. So go for it.
I was just going to say, I think that, as we look at the generational flow of workforce and people, that it also matters, what companies represent and what their corporate citizenship role is. Are they allowing volunteerism? And if they're being flexible and responsive to that, one of the big benefits, I'm not going to call it a perk anymore, it's almost like a right, is childcare. Childcare assistance or offering childcare is so important to workers today. And then not only female workers, but male workers too. So companies are being, I believe, responsive to the demands and the needs of the workers so that they can attract the best talent, the right talent, and doing it in very different ways. And I think we're all going to have to do the same as we go about trying to keep our operations and our workforce going.
Love it. So Erin, Gerald, Machelle, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please know how much we appreciate the great work you all are doing, and thank you for sharing your time and your insights on this important topic.